Greetings and welcome to my channel. Today I want to bring you a video that's a little bit different for this channel. I want to give you the history and the origins of what we now call Halloween. And that's very appropriate because when I'm filming this, Halloween will be in another 3 days. So, I wanted to bring you guys a little bit of history is how we got to Halloween the way that we did in the United States. Halloween is not widely celebrated like it is here in the US. It's just not their custom to celebrate the way that we do, you know, with the trick-or-treaters and the parties and everything that we have now. But I wanted to let you know how we got here in the United States, and maybe that would help shed a little bit of light. Now everybody, just assumes that Halloween and its association with Samhain, the Celtic Sabbath of Samhain, are just a direct relation and how you got from one to the other. And there's a lot more that happened between that and where we are today here in the United States. So the Celtic Celebration of Samhain, which is spelled Samhain, but it's pronounced Samhain, was the third harvest festival of the year, with the first one being in August, the second one being in September, the third one, the final one, being October 31st. And it's also the Celtic and Druidic New Year, as well as now it's the New Year for modern day witches and Wiccans. So the way that the Celts celebrated Samhain, they had large bonfires. This celebration was, you were bringing in the final of your stores. You were slaughtering animals and salting and drying and preparing the meat to get you through the winter. This was all about putting away your harvest for the winter and surviving the winter. Samhain is literally a celebration of life and death, because if you had, poor crops and, poor harvest, or, your, the fruits of your labor bore, a kind of, like blight, or, some kind of rot, or an insect infestation, your family might not survive the winter. It's about death and rebirth. It's transitioning from the light of summer to the darkness of the winter. It also marked the merging of the realms, where humans could, by legend, wander out in the night and get lost in the other world. In other words, the spirit world. And likewise, spirits had free reign to come to the human realm, and this domain. And they could coexist on the same realm on this night. Now, some of the familiar symbols of Halloween came from particular celebration customs related to Samhain. Okay, when they built their bonfires, that drew insects, and then the insects drew the bat. At night, you can't see the bats because there's no light. Think, ancient civilizations. They didn't have, street lights lighting everything. They didn't have electricity. So, for them, the bat was an unseen thing, unless it was on Samhain and the bonfires drew them to the insects. They could see the bats at night. Now, it's also a time to celebrate and recognize the dead. Now, these particular traditions about preparing for, the winter, or preparing for when your crops go, your growing cycle is over, the crops go fallow for a period of time, and putting away stores, to make it through. These are familiar themes running through most agricultural societies of the time. It was not just, these traditions were not just limited to the Celts. Now, believe it or not, Christianity helped spawn Halloween. There you go. Uh, the Christian church can actually, as much as a lot of Christian churches denounce Halloween, etc., today, the early Christian church helped establish Halloween. Now, the way that they did it is, as Christianity spread and it grew, the church leaders recognized that even though people were converting, they were still holding on to their pagan festivals and still celebrating pagan festivals. So what they did is they reimagined many pagan festivals to then coexist and then eventually replace pagan festivals once someone is converted. So coming up with competition for pagan festivals made it easier for the early church to convert people to Christianity. Okay. So, now, one celebration of the dead that the early church needed to get rid of, basically, was the Roman celebration of Lemuria. Lemuria. And I will put that down in the little at the bottom of the screen. Now, Roman Lemuria, when celebrants placated the dead, they made offerings to the dead, was held on May the 13th. Okay. And the Romans believed that during that time, the dead would rise and haunt the living. And so to placate the dead, Romans would pour milk on the graves of the dead or offer them little cakes. Now remember this, little cakes. Okay. Now, the Christian church co-opted Lemuria in 600 AD and created All Saints' Day on May the 13th. Okay. And this is where they honored the most holy of dead Christians, okay? Because All Saints' Days kept alive many of the same things as Lemuria, it was easier for pagans to accept this celebration and convert to Christianity, okay? Now, the acceptance of All Saints' Day was so successful that the church eventually moved All Saints' Day to November 1st to effectively drain the life out of Samhain, okay? Because Samhain fell on October 31st, people soon celebrated All Hallows Evening. All Saints Day, All Saints, or Hallows Day was then shortened to All Hallows Eve, even, EV apostrophe N, and then again shortened to Halloween. Okay. Now, to be safe, the church then created All Souls Day on November 2nd, where all the dead were remembered and celebrated. Not, all the dead Christians, not just the most holy, the saints, such as that, where everyday people are to be remembered. The early church is actually responsible for the associations with the supernatural, creepy things, and the dead. Okay? The early church is also responsible for creating a tradition that was a very, very early version of trick-or-treating. And this occurred in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, priests told Christians to pray for souls trapped in purgatory on All Souls Day. And you have to remember that, in the Catholic Church, purgatory isn't hell, it isn't heaven. It's an existence in between. It's a miserable place still to be, but it's not hell, kind of thing. But in order for a soul to be released from purgatory, that soul must be prayed for. And then once enough prayers for that soul are made, then they are allowed into heaven. So this practice of praying for the dead on All Souls Day to get them out of purgatory then gave birth to the medieval custom of children going door to door souling and asking for soul cakes. So this is a very, very early version of trick-or-treating. And soul cakes were spiced cakes that were filled with raisins. And after the child was, or teenager was given the soul cake, then they would pray for that lost soul in purgatory, okay, for the lost souls in purgatory. So the medieval Christian church is also responsible for the association of witches with evil. And it was really easy during this time, for the church to put forth warnings of witches to strike fear and mistrust, okay? They often said that demons and witches were responsible for all the bad things in the world, and that they should be hunted down and killed. Now, you've got to remember the Inquisition. You've got to remember the witch trials. You need to remember the Salem witch trials in the 1600s. So, in Europe, these attitudes led to a witch panic in the 16th century. And it also depicted and gave the look that now epitomizes a Halloween witch, okay? Witches were almost always women, okay? It was almost always women that were singled out, okay? They were told to be, or said to be, people were told that they were in league with Satan. And in reality, the women that were targeted typically lived alone. They may have been a little bit eccentric, and they were most likely the healers in their communities. And their healing traditions were most likely passed down orally, because general people did not know how to read and write. A lot of nobility didn't even know how to read and write during the Middle Ages. So they became very suspicious for the other villagers because they could often heal when doctors could not. And they were also the midwives. And the church said that these women sacrificed newborns. And if you think back how many newborns were stillborn, children died at a very early age, etc., 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 through no fault of anyone other than the circumstances of the time. There was no modern medicine. There were no antibiotics. There were no, they didn't practice, clean antiseptic environments for something like childbirth like we do now. Okay. So a lot of the symbols that are associated with these women, such as their brooms that they use to sweep their hearth and their homes with, to the cauldron that was used. Every household had a cauldron, because a cauldron was in essence a big cooking pot. So you would find a cauldron in every hearth in the village if they cooked, and there was no McDonald's back then. So every household had a cauldron. Now, where some of the earliest mentions of women flying on brooms actually came from a practice where some of the women would rub an ointment on their bodies in certain like pulse point areas, the neck, each wrist, each elbow, armpits, groin area, with an ointment that included psychoactive herbs like belladonna, which is poisonous, by the way. And these psychoactive herbs would give one the sensation of flying. And women would put either a broom or a stick between their legs and run through the fields to teach the crops how high to grow. Okay, so those were the earliest kind of mentions of women flying on brooms, not necessarily witches, but women's. And then another symbol that was attached to witches and affiliated with witches now is the pointed hat. And that hat is actually derived from a poorer countrywoman's hat that was typical of that time. It wasn't specifically affiliated with a witch or, anybody else, but it was a woman's hat that they would wear when they were out and about working in the fields, etc., etc. Now, this is also the time when black cats became affiliated with witches and evil, and most households had cats either inside or out because they helped kill the mice. They killed the mice in your corn crib. in your corn crib, help feed your animals through the winter. You didn't really want rats and rodents running around eating your food and your stores that you had to feed your family. So cats were a great pest control. Plus, if they got rid of the rats and everything, they got rid of the disease that a lot, carried with them. So, where did these cats like to hang out? On the hearths, by the brooms that sat by the hearth to sweep the hearth out. So there you have, the hearth with the cauldron, with the broom next to it, with a kitty cat curled up, a little black kitty cat curled up in front of it on the hearth trying to stay warm. There's where you get a lot of your great big symbols for Halloween. Now, bonfires, worshiping the dead, and begging for treats were common in Europe at the dawn of the 17th century, so in the 1600s. However, rowdy beggars often involved alcoholic spirits in their celebrations, and then they turned to mischief and destruction. Now remember this, okay? Now, the beggars would then go out and demand, and their demands became more and more threatening. So what they did was don masks to conceal their identities so they couldn't be taken away for, making threats and causing mischief. And in Britain, it was also common for folks to band together and go house to house and put on skits, and they would be rewarded with food and sometimes money for the little plays that they put on. So that involved the donning of costumes. Okay, so a lot of these customs were only in the rural parts during the 17th century England, but soon they would go into the cities, and it was due to the actions of a pro-Catholic terrorist named Guy Fawkes, excuse me. Now, on November 5th, 1605, Guy Fawkes tried to blow up the House of Lords with 36 kegs of gunpowder. He was found guilty and hanged. And legend has it that after he was hanged, his body was then drawn and quartered, and the pieces of his body were then thrown into a fire. Okay, now the following year, and years after, children of London mocked the memory of Guy Fawkes by causing chaos in the streets. They often paraded the streets, they begged door to door, they built bonfires. And today, all over England, this is referred to as Guy Fawkes Night or Bonfire Night. Now, since Halloween was so close to Guy Fawkes Day, a lot of the energies in England shifted to Guy Fawkes Day, okay? And these traditions aren't exactly what we celebrate, now, but they had all the earmarks of modern day Halloween, okay? Children and adults in costumes, obscuring their identities, and then kind of letting loose, so to speak. Now, in the U.S., despite the efforts of colonial Puritans, these traditions managed to make their way to America. For the Puritans of New England, the supernatural was a dark and menacing force to be feared, and they weren't just harmless superstitions. And a few of the Guy Fawkes celebrations made their way to America. Okay. The other settlers tolerated and even embraced the traditions associated with Guy Fawkes. And those seeds would eventually morph into what we call the American Halloween. Okay, there are early descriptions of our traditions of telling scary or ghost stories. The first one that you really find like in writing is in 1833, and that is another thing that is now associated with Halloween. Now, where the telling of ghost stories and America's fascination with death and dying and spirits and ghosts happened in the 1860s after during and after the American Civil War. And during the American Civil War, there were over half a million men killed. Okay. And there were numerous battles where bodies went unidentified and they were thrown into mass graves. So it was up to the townspeople to dispose of tens of thousands of bodies. There's no way that they could have done that and dug individual graves and got every soldier identified. So every major battlefield had mass graves. That's just the realization of it all. So a lot of the themes during this time in Halloween involved a family or the lost soldiers finding their way home. Okay. So these were really among some of the first types of ghost stories that were commonly told in America, was about lost Civil War soldiers coming home. Now, when the Scots and the Irish immigrants brought their old world kind of Halloween traditions with them, they helped establish more American Halloween traditions when they came. Now, for the Scots, it was more of a scary night, and they involved stories about bogies, what we call the boogeyman. Okay, and bogies were these kind of pestering ghosts that plagued children all of the time, and they often hid under beds and tapped on the windows and stuff like that. And during that time, bogies were said to lurk by gates and turnstiles. So at the time, Scots used to say that there was a bogey on every stile. So in other words, if you crossed any gate, there could be something there to get you. A boogeyman could be there to get you. Okay. Now, the jack-o'-lantern is also a European tradition that made it here to the United States. However, the first jack-o'-lanterns were really carved out of turnips. And the tradition originated in Ireland, involving the story of Stingy Jack. And Stingy Jack was a miserable old coot who liked to take pleasure in playing tricks on his family, friends, stuff like that. Well, Stingy Jack even played a trick on the devil. He convinced the devil to climb a tree and then put crosses all around the tree so that the devil couldn't come down, because the devil can't touch a cross, right? So he struck a deal with the devil and made the devil promise that when Stingy Jack, died, that the devil would not take him to hell. Well, the devil agreed. So Stingy Jack, pulled up his crosses, and the devil climbed down the tree and went on his merry little way. Now, when Jack actually died, he arrives at the gates, and St. Peter tells him, says, listen, you are too mean and too cruel to enter heaven. You're not getting in. Go on your merry way. And Jack was sent down to hell. Well, he shows up at hell, and the devil kept his promise. Wouldn't let him into hell. So he was doomed to wander the in-between for all eternity. Now, there is no light in the in-between. So Jack asked Satan, to, in essence, help him out and not make him wander the dark forever. So what Satan did was toss him embers from hell. And Jack loved turnips, and he had a turnip in his pocket. So what he did was hollow that turnip out and place the embers of hell inside the turnip. And then that was his lantern for him to wander the betwixt and between forever and ever. So that was where the legends of Stingy Jack roaming the night with his jack-o'-lantern, his turnip, forever. So in Ireland, on All Hallows Evening, the Irish hollowed out turnips and put turnips, rutabagas, gourds, potatoes, and even beets, root vegetables, okay? And they placed a candle in them to ward off the evil spirits and to keep Stingy Jack away. Now, this came to America in the 1800s with the waves of Irish immigrants. And they didn't have pumpkins in Ireland, but pumpkins are an indigenous crop in the United States, in America. So they discovered that these pumpkins were bigger and easier to carve out than a turnip, so that they began the tradition of using pumpkins to carve their jack-o'-lanterns. Okay? Children then began using the jack-o'-lantern lit with a candle, mounted on a stick, and then used a sheet to disguise the stick, and they would go around and pop these, jack-o'-lanterns up into the windows of, unsuspecting people and scare the bejesus out of them. So this is how the jack-o'-lantern became a widely accepted symbol of Halloween associated with pumpkins in America. But the Scots and Irish also brought with them the more rambunctious traditions of throwing rocks through windows and causing mischief and mayhem in general. Now, American artists at the beginning of the 20th century began illustrating Halloween with the common colors of orange and black, and they brought together all the common symbols that we know now affiliated with Halloween: ghosts, skeletons, spider webs, witches, black cats, bats, and jack-o'-lanterns, the creepy crawly things that go bump in the night. Now, these early artists established the look of Halloween that we still use today in America. The sheet that Ghost wears is directly derived from the winding cloth or the shroud that wrapped the bodies of the dead. Okay, the faces carved into the pumpkins became more menacing and, like the imagery of death. Okay, horned devils came from medieval depictions of Satan from the church. Witches from the witch hunting hysteria that swept through Europe and America. Um, However, at the beginning of the 20th century, witches had become a little bit more popular, and the artists sometimes drew them to be more beautiful. They were not typically drawn as old hags with warts and crooked noses, but they were drawn to be more attractive and less threatening, and sometimes a little bit naughty. Um, so, at the beginning of the 20th century, it was common for American boys to set things on fire, throw rocks, and cause mayhem and destruction on Halloween. And in Chicago, big cities like Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, things really got out of hand. And it wasn't just, quote unquote, smashing pumpkins anymore or rolling a buggy up on a haystack. They caused major fires, okay? And the kids were even taking bars of soap and soaping down the rails of streetcars so the streetcars would derail and people really got hurt. And they would also, back then, it was typical for your stairs to not be attached to your house. The kids would take the stair steps leading out of the house and down and move them. And so the next, that night or the next morning, sometimes the kids would knock on the door and somebody would open the door and step out to see who's there, and they would fall and get hurt because the steps had been moved. They also, in the country, they would open the gates or remove the gates and let farm animals out of their paddocks and pens. And that was just horrible. And in some areas, communities called Halloween Gate Night. In the cities, it was typically referred to Mischief Night or even Hell Night. So things really got out of hand during the American Depression. And it probably was attributed to the circumstances of the time. It was an excuse for troublemaking. But communities could not afford to fix the damage. They couldn't even afford to feed people who were literally starving to death in their community. Much less pay for the destruction by, kids running amok on Halloween. So, in 1933, Halloween was actually dubbed Black Halloween by newspapers because of the widespread destruction that was caused that night. They set fires to buildings. They would smash street lamps. They smashed car windows. And it was just completely out of control. So this kind of caused the schools, police departments, and newspapers and communities to band together to try and find alternative ways for kids to celebrate Halloween by taming it, okay? They began to invent all sorts of things for kids to do rather than leaving them to their own, discretion and causing mayhem all over the place. They promoted town-wide parties, costume contests, parades, and games to play. Anything to get the kids away from pulling pranks and tricks. Now, novelty companies began issuing books on Halloween celebration suggestions, and some of the first ones were by Denison Publishers, and they were called Bogey books. And these books helped created the atmosphere of the Halloween party instead of letting Halloween be a night of destruction. Denison was the first company to realize that there was money to be made on Halloween. So in following years, they actually made the first paper masks and paper costumes for retail sale at local drugstores all over America. Okay. Prior to that, all the costumes were homemade. Okay. But unfortunately, these paper costumes had drawbacks. They were extremely flammable, and there were numerous um, times where it was documented that children's costumes caught fire. Okay. So other manufacturers then stepped in and they wanted to tap into that Halloween market, and they began making the costumes more durable. In other words, they weren't out of paper. Um, Sears boxed costumes came out about 1930 or so, and the costumes were based on radio show and comic book characters. Um, and the costumes were designed for townwide parties, school and church parties, and not pranking. And Halloween then started becoming a big social occasion. Um, Halloween parades were the most common in towns. And it is commonly held that Allentown, Pennsylvania, had the very first Halloween parade in 1906. And, it became very popular over the next 20-25 years to do things. In fact, Anoka, Minnesota continues to hold its Halloween parade to this day and has even coined itself and marketed itself as Halloween capital of the world. So these alternative activities help change the face of Halloween celebrations in America. Now, the trick or treating and its association with mass produced candies evolved, even though the custom of handing out soul cakes dated back centuries. Okay. The phrase trick or treat is only about 80 years old. And it's derivative from the pranking that was very prevalent in the early 20th century in the US. Um, there came the idea of buying off the tricksters with treats so that you wouldn't get pranked. So many early trick-or-treaters received homemade candied apples and popcorn balls, homemade popcorn balls, as their treats. This custom, I remember this custom even when I was a kid, doing my trick-or-treating thing in the 60s, late 60s and early 70s. Folks, were still trusted enough to, you didn't think twice about your neighbors giving out homemade, candied or caramel apples or doing homemade popcorn balls. Your parents knew everybody in the neighborhood, and thus it was okay for you to eat whatever they did, because half the time you were hanging out at those houses with their kids anyway. So it's not like it is today. I mean, I grew up in a suburb of Washington D.C., and we knew everybody, and that's not the case now. I can't tell you the names of several of my neighbors. I mean, they won't even look at you when you wave to them across the parking lot or anything. So the phrase trick or treat showed up in print in 1933 in the way that it also connected it with the custom of handing out treats. And Doris Hudson Moss published an article in American Home magazine where she described that she held a Halloween open house for the kids in her neighborhood. She didn't get tricked. She handed out treats, and it all worked. So that kind of came out the trick or treat. Okay. Eventually, people began handing out mass produced um, candies, commercial candies like Mars bars, Mr. Goodbar, Reese's Cups, Baby Ruths, and plain old Hershey bars. Candy finally tamed the rowdy Halloween. And Hollywood then helped the reinvented traditions really come to and be known to the masses. And it happened through things like cartoons like Donald Duck. Um, and it was quickly being integrated in and accepted into pop culture in the United States. However, Halloween became completely mainstream with It's the Great Pumpkin Charlie Brown premiere on television in 1966. I remember watching this cartoon, Peanuts, anything when I was a kid. I mean, I remember from about 1968 on, so it was a couple years old, but it was still relatively new when I was little. Um, and I remember sitting there and watching them every single year. It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown. Um, and then in 1978, Hollywood struck again and came up with a widely accepted mainstream film by John Carpenter called Halloween. This then involved the adults on a level other than handing out candy. This movie spawned an entire new genre of film aimed at adults at Halloween. And it no longer were horror films considered only B movie films. I mean, you can think back to some of the ones like, from the early 60s and stuff, that they were always the B movies, right? Although a lot of them are classics now and I love them. But Halloween changed the game. It was completely responsible for creating a new genre of horror films. And up until this point, there were thrillers. You think about the classic Alfred Hitchcocks, like The Birds and Psycho and, you know, Vertigo and some of the other classic movies. And you can also think about, The Exorcist and Rosemary's Baby. They started it, but this was specifically aimed at Halloween. It wasn't just a regular horror film. So it also is responsible for creating and changing the mask industry. Now, Michael Myers' mask, most people don't realize that unless you're like a movie geek buff like me, Michael Myers' mask was actually a really bad Captain Kirk mask from Star Trek. And it looked absolutely nothing like William Shatner whatsoever. But the prop department, spray painted it, did a few things to it, mushed the hair and blah, blah, and made it what it is now. So this then spurned that mask, created an industry for masks for adults. Because before then, the masks were, the ones that just covered the eyes for adults. Or for kids, when I was a kid, they were hard plastic. They had a little, rubber band that went around you, and they were yucky. You couldn't halfway see, you couldn't halfway breathe, you couldn't halfway talk in them. Where this mask, it had some, potential to it. Um, so then you also think about Halloween wardrobes and Halloween costumes. And back in the day, it was primarily comic book, TV characters, and movie characters, right? Now you have kids that had their influence, like, I remember seeing um, Nightmare on Elm Street in the theater back in the 80s. Um, and I saw, movies like Halloween after I got up, out in high school and stuff like that. I saw it in the movie theater. Scared the bejesus out of me. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, one of the classic movie, you know, horror films. But then those costumes came in demand in the general population. There are even stores now. Halloween is such a big business. There are stores now that sell Halloween masks and costumes all year long. Another thing that became popular is adult themed parties and costume parties. Okay. It wasn't just about kids anymore. Because, folks from my generation, like when we started having kids in the 80s, they're like, damn, I missed this. So we'd dress up and schlep our kids along, with us. And that came, out of the stories, the urban legends of the razor blades and the apples and tainted candy and stuff like that. And we wanted to make sure that our kids were safe. So I remember in the 80s going to Georgetown, which is a very affluent neighborhood in Washington, in the actual Washington, D.C. itself. It's in the district itself. It's a very she upper crust neighborhood where all the money was. And it was also the place where we had our music venues, our dance clubs. It is where we had alternative clothing for the it was just the gay community at the time. And that's the way it was referred to back then. There was a place like Commander Salamander's where you could get, not only, the studded leather that, Rob Halford from Judas Priest wore. Nobody knew back then that he was gay. So that was a place where we could go and get, studded collars and the wristbands and the leather jackets and all that kind of stuff. But you picked up on the fact that this was an alternative clothing establishment the first time that you walked into Commander Salamander's. And that was really my first look at the gay society, because where I lived in the suburbs, you had suspicions about people, but they were not openly gay. In Georgetown, the men in Georgetown were openly gay. I don't really remember that much with the women being openly gay back then, but the men were openly gay. And the big thing about going to Georgetown was the Halloween parade. And it was adults only. They have them in, many of the larger cities, like in Hollywood and in New York. San Francisco has, a very famous Halloween parade, but it's adult all the way. And the costumes were very risque. not only were, the girls dressed up real sexy and everything, people made costumes that were really anatomically correct, but it covered everything. It wasn't your stuff that was showing, but it sure looked like you was walking down the street naked as a jaybird. But there you have it. And or as I will never forget, a giant penis walking down the streets of Georgetown. I will never forget that shock of my early, like late teens, early 20s life. So in the 70s and 80s, adult themed Halloween parties became very acceptable. And then you see now most adult costumes, especially for women, are, the sexy witch, the sexy nurse, the sexy doctor, the sexy whatever. That came out of those traditions in the early 80s. So, and it's a huge, huge, booming business. Now, the focus of Halloween is still for the kids. The traditions of children trick-or-treating are still alive and well. I still hand out candy. But it's a way where Americans have flipped, turning their biggest fears into fun for children and adults alike. And that includes haunted houses. There are over 4,000 haunted house attractions in the United States that are long-standing businesses for adult clientele. You think about shows like, Paranormal State, Ghost Adventures, Ghost Hunters, The Dead Files, things like that. Those shows would not be popular if the haunted house had never been invented. And then it would also never have afforded those communities with buildings like penitentiaries and insane asylums, orphanages that were no longer in service, and they were turning into blight. Those communities turned them into paranormal attractions, and they generate money and pump money into the community, and they're open all year long. Stop and think about places like Trans-Allegheny Insane Asylum, Eastern State Penitentiary, Moundsville Penitentiary. Those are just three right off the top of my head that are within a 5-hour driving distance of my home. And that's not all of them. So, Halloween has emerged from a celebration to acknowledge the coming winter and preparing for it, and the fight, the fine line between life and death, and then also, rebirth, to, trying to take away our fears and turning Halloween into a fun tradition for adults and kids alike. So that's how we've gotten to where we are in the United States with our Halloween celebrations. I hope you guys have found this a little bit interesting. If you did, give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe to the channel before you leave. And you guys know what I always say. Until we meet again, be well and walk in love and light. Bye.